Something was wrong with Desi. Lazy and headstrong in his 20s, he went further and further off the rails in his 30s before becoming a full-blown, aggressive conspiracy crank during the COVID pandemic lockdowns in his 50s. Wasn't the snap defensive reaction of a frightened man, but something else entirely. It was more a terrifying tantrum by a nasty, neurotic narcissist. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. Very big week in crime. It's the week that the law reached out and extinguished the life of Dezi Freeman, or the man who called himself Dezi Freeman. It all started out very differently. The people we expect to do the dirty, dangerous work that keeps us safe, the police and the prison officers, they know that killers come in at least two varieties, maybe more. Some were made that way by the life they were born into or the life they had imposed on them. But others were born with the sort of malevolence that in more religious times we simply called evil. So which was Dezi Freeman? Was he born bad or was he made that way? Was it nature or nurture? Were those grandiose delusions and venomous hatreds always in him, or did something flick a switch, turning him into the crazed and calculating monster who would shoot two policemen in the face, wound another one, and in fact try to kill a female officer? Luckily, his gun did not go off that time. The fact that this self-styled renegade had assembled a homemade shotgun and an embarrassingly successful escape route suggests that the murderous ambush at Purupunka last August was planned for the day when police would inevitably turn up to serve a warrant that he knew was coming. So turning the shotgun on police after a long verbal exchange wasn't the snap defensive reaction of a frightened man, but something else entirely. It was more a terrifying tantrum by a nasty, neurotic narcissist living a contemptible lie. He made a show of disowning mainstream society and government and the law, but he put his hand out for welfare payments. The public is not going to know all of what the police are still uncovering until there is a full and open inquest into Freeman's obvious suicide by cop, plus the inquests into the deaths of his two victims, police officers Neil Thompson and Vadim Dewart. There may well be surprises in the police briefs to come, but not many shocks to rank with those two blood-stained events 7 months apart that bookend the Freeman saga. The investigation of two homicides and a police shooting will be detailed and exhaustive, but will not necessarily answer the question most of us ponder. Who was the man who called himself Dezi Freeman, and why did he do what he did? The apparently normal lad named Desmond Christopher Philby was named after a dead uncle and an apparently loving and gentle father, Christopher John Philby. Christopher Philby, Sr., was English-born and had migrated to Australia in the 1950s with his parents, James and Gertrude Philby, and an older brother, Desmond, who would die tragically young in 1958, a decade before a new baby nephew was named in his memory in 1969. Christopher Philby had married Patricia Ann Williams in Victoria in 1961, by which time the older Philbys, the old English ones, had operated a small business much like their former occupation as grain merchants back in Britain. Christopher and Patricia, the ones married in 61, would have 3 sons and a daughter. Desmond Christopher, was the third son. What happens in other people's heads and other people's beds is hard to know. Families, as one saying goes, are trench warfare. But there's only one thing on the public record to suggest any upheaval that might have conceivably had lingering effects on Desi and his sister and brothers. That was the fact that their parents went bankrupt in 1986, sometime after moving to Wodonga on the Victorian side of the Murray River border. They lived first at 327 Beechworth Road, Wodonga, then at 25 Auburn Street, a neat brick veneer house that looks as if it was built in the 1980s, around the time they lived there. The move meant that Desi and his siblings, after starting life in Glen Waverley, would grow up in Wodonga and so become familiar with the northeast and its people. A family snapshot taken in the early 80s shows a smiling and happy young Desi, a kid aged about 12, dressed in jeans and a T-shirt, smiling, sitting with his father Christopher, who's a neatly dressed, mild-looking man, pictured with a projector and what looked like classic home movies of the slide night variety. Just normal folks, living a life. So far, so normal. There was no sign of the trouble ahead. But something was wrong with Desi. Lazy and headstrong in his 20s, he went further and further off the rails in his 30s before becoming a full-blown, aggressive conspiracy crank during the COVID pandemic lockdowns in his 50s. He somehow combined increasingly florid delusions and conspiracies with suddenly regular religious observance, turning up to church every Sunday for years, which was at odds with his teenage taste for heavy metal music, something which he later denounced in apocalyptic terms. It's the work of the devil, etc. He went overboard in every way. He was 33 years old, the biblical age, the age when Jesus Christ was crucified, when he changed his name from Desmond Christopher Philby to Dezi Bird Freeman back in 2003. His parents were around to see this slide into an alternative lifestyle and increasingly ugly attitudes. But luckily for them, Christopher and Patricia died a few years apart before their third son's mad and murderous confrontation with police at Porepunkah last August. It wasn't the only death in the family. His sister-in-law, Danelle, a young mother of 4 boys and wife of Desi's brother James, died at Wodonga in 2019. At the time, the Border Morning Mail newspaper stated that Danelle died suddenly in tragic circumstances and that her husband, James, was in hospital with severe pneumonia. This was in the winter of 2019, 6 years before the Porepunkah shootings. Christopher Philby, the father, had died in Wodonga the year before, and his widow, Desi's mother Patricia, died in Albury in 2023, which meant that if his parents had been moderating influences on his increasingly bizarre behaviour, they were long gone before the Porepunkah shootings. So, publicly, Desi was just another cooker, as the saying goes, of the type who came to the fore during the COVID lockdowns and the accompanying anti-vaccination protests. But privately, it seems, he'd become something far more sinister. In fact, according to police and ex-police, he was similar to another notorious cop killer who apparently came out of nowhere. This was the one dubbed Mad Max, former Bulgarian army deserter Pavel Marinov, alias Max Clark. It was Marinov's outbreak of violence 40 years ago that turned Victoria's previously peaceable police force into a shoot-first outfit that swiftly became well known for shooting armed offenders over several years. Marinov was even more obscure than Dezi Freeman had been before the Porepunkah shootings. A lone wolf with few criminal associates and no known form, Marinov had a secret life as a self-taught pistol sharpshooter and a prolific solo burglar. The night that police pulled him over in an industrial estate in Melbourne's east, he shot 2 officers and then 2 more in the manhunt that followed. All 4 were badly wounded. 1 left paraplegic. A 5th was hit but saved by his ballistic vest. Mad Max Marinoff stayed on the loose for 8 months, becoming Australia's most wanted man, taking over from master prison escapee Russell Mad Dog Cox, who'd been on the run since 1977. Pavel Marinoff's assault on the police force was arguably then the most savage example since the Kelly gang shot 3 police dead at Stringy Bark Creek in 1878. Marinoff's outbreak predated by 2 years the murder of 2 young constables in Wall Street, South Yarra. Like Dezi Freeman, Marinoff was a relatively unknown offender with no close associates or strong criminal history, so police could not tap the underworld for information about him. Fugitives who stay clear of the underworld and its treacherous and temporary alliances have a far better chance of staying uncaught. Another example of this is the case of the prolific armed robber Greg Smith, known as Doc Smith, who steered clear of criminals after he broke out of Pentridge Prison around 1980 and was able to make his way to Perth, then New Zealand, then India, before finally being caught in Germany 10 years later. An astonishing feat of the fugitive's craft to fly to several different countries, not just the ones we've named, but others as well. He said he ran guns and drugs across the Middle East and Africa, and I've got no reason to doubt that. Mostly because he steered clear of mainstream underworld contacts, so there was no one to give him up. The hunt for Dezi Freeman brought back memories for a former major crime squad detective called Alex Christick. Christick had befriended the young Neil Thompson when they'd both worked at Collingwood Police Station in uniform, and he was shocked to see his old friend killed at Porapunka on the eve of his retirement. Neil Thompson was doing his last job at Porapunka when he was shot dead. He was going to retire that week. The hunt for Freeman and its blood-soaked ending this week resonated with Alex Christick, who all those years ago was called into the hunt for Mad Max, as in Marinoff, and he was at Wallen, north of Melbourne, the day that 2 of his colleagues from the major crime squad pulled over Marinoff, although they weren't dead sure it was the wanted gunman. They thought it was him driving a white panel van, but they weren't dead sure because the driver of the white panel van had what looked like long hair, which was actually a wig. In both cases, there had been many months of nothing before a dramatic, fatal, out-of-the-blue confrontation with police. In both cases, the men had supporters who kept them going, it would appear. We know that that's the fact with Marinoff, and we can fairly safely assume that's the fact with Freeman. But Christick points out some differences between the 2 fugitives. Both were dangerous, of course, but in Christick's estimation, and I quote, he, Mad Max, had balls like coconuts, whereas this bloke's just vermin. As we recounted more fully in our episode, The Last Stand of Mad Max, Marinoff, the self-taught sharpshooter, managed to shoot and wound 2 detectives armed with shotguns when they pulled him over in that panel van at Calcallo on the Hume Highway just south of Wallen, where Marinoff had been hiding out with a biker's family. Despite being wounded, Detective Rod McDonald shot his shotgun through the back of the van. Now, we've discussed this before on this podcast, and we pointed out that Rod McDonald and his partner in policing, a big tough guy known as Kappa, had armed themselves not just with pump-action shotguns, but they'd loaded them with heavy shot, buckshot, what's known as SGs, which are 9 slugs to the cartridge, and they're very, very heavy, very, very dangerous. And that is why they had loaded them into their shotguns. And when they were both wounded by Marinoff's shooting them through the window of the panel van, Rob McDonald saw the car speed away from him and he levelled his shotgun and shot instantly, I think 2 shots through the rear of the panel van. And the buckshot was so heavy it went through the van, through the seat and struck the driver, the fugitive. The effect of that was that Marinoff was really badly wounded and he ran the van off the road into a paddock. We have been through this story before and we know that the 2 wounded police had to go to a farmhouse to get help. They didn't have mobile phones in those days. It's 40 years ago. They had to get a very scared farmer's wife to ring the police headquarters, etc., etc. And it was sometime later that Christic, who had been stationed up the road at Wallen, got the call to go down and see what was going on in the van. They were nervous that Mad Max was playing possum in the van and that if they walked up to the van, approached it, that he might take some police with him by shooting them. But after they'd circled the van for some time with the police helicopter looking down, they thought there was no sign of life, but still they're careful. It was Christic who got the job of going out to the van very cautiously a little while later to make sure that Marinoff wasn't playing possum. He told my colleague Mark Butler this week, "I pulled his wig off. He was dead as Julius Caesar," as was Desmond Christopher Philby last Monday after a whole bunch of SOG marksmen shot him about 20 times. Of course, it's up to a coroner to rule on exactly what happened and when and why and how. But for most Victorians, most Australians, it's a case of good riddance. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.